The cold was a constant companion. It lived in the stones of the citadel, seeped through the soles of her worn-out shoes, and settled deep in her bones. Alara had worked in the kitchens for 5 years since she was old enough to be put to use, and she couldn't remember a single day of genuine warmth. She was an orphan, a foundling left at the citadel's gates as an infant, a ghost drifting through the periphery of power. Her world was the clatter of pots, the sting of lye soap, and the pervasive scent of wood smoke and damp stone. She was invisible, and that was her only shield. She kept her head down, her hands busy, and her voice quiet. The other staff, born into the pack structure, treated her with a detached sort of pity that was worse than outright scorn. She was packless, nameless in any meaningful way, a stray taken in not out of kindness, but because a pair of hands was always useful. She felt her worthlessness like a shroud, heavy and suffocating. The king was a ghost of a different sort, Alpha King Malachi, a name spoken in whispers, a figure of myth and terror, even within his own walls. They said he was made of ice and shadow, that his heart had frozen the day his queen and their firstborn daughter had been consumed by the fire that scarred the western wing of the castle. He was haunted, a king ruling over a kingdom of memories, his grief a palpable force that chilled the air more than any winter wind. Ilara had only seen him a handful of times, a tall, broad-shouldered silhouette moving down a distant corridor, his presence sucking all the sound and warmth from the space around him. He was beautiful in the way a glacier was beautiful, vast, ancient, and merciless. His eyes, they said, were the color of a winter sky before a blizzard. But it was the other ghost she thought of most, the little prince, Kalen, the boy who had survived the fire that took his mother and sister. He was 8 years old now, but he was a wild thing, a feral creature of grief and trauma. He didn't speak. He hid in the shadows, snarled at his minders, and tore at anything that came too close. They called him the feral pup, the broken heir, a living, breathing testament to the king's unending sorrow. Her hands were raw, plunged into a basin of scalding water as she scrubbed a heavy iron pot. The head cook, Marta, barked orders, her voice sharp as a butcher's knife. Ilara flinched but said nothing, her gaze fixed on the murky water. She didn't belong here. The thought was as constant as the cold, a dull ache behind her ribs. She didn't belong anywhere. A sudden commotion from the pantry shattered the rhythmic clang and bustle of the kitchen. A crash, a high-pitched shriek from one of the younger maids, and then a series of frantic shouts. "He's in here! Block the door!" Alara's heart stuttered. The prince. Two guards in the king's silver and black livery appeared, their faces grim. "Everyone out," one commanded, his hand on the hilt of his sword. The kitchen staff scurried away, clucking and muttering, but Alara froze. Through the open pantry door she could see him. Prince Kalen was backed into a corner, a small trembling whirlwind of fury. His fine clothes were torn, his face smudged with dirt, and his dark hair was a wild mess. But it was his eyes that held her. They were his father's eyes, but not cold. They were burning with a terrified, desperate fire. He was clutching a stolen apple, holding it like a weapon, and a low, guttural growl vibrated in his chest. He was a cornered animal, ready to fight to the death. "Your Highness," one of the guards said, his voice a strained attempt at calm. "Come now, let's go back to your rooms." He took a step forward. The growl intensified. Kalen's little body was coiled like a spring. He wasn't a prince. He was a wolf pup, lost and terrified, and they were closing in on him. Ilara felt a strange pang in her chest, a resonance with the boy's terror. She knew what it was to be cornered, to have nowhere to run. Without thinking, without understanding why, she moved. She slipped past the guards before they could stop her, ignoring their sharp hisses of protest. She didn't approach the boy. Instead, she sank to the floor about 10 feet away from him, tucking her legs beneath her, making herself small. The world seemed to fall away. The shouts of the guards, the frantic energy of the kitchen. It all faded into a dull hum. There was only the frightened boy in the corner and the cold stone floor beneath her. She didn't speak. What could she say? Instead, she started to hum. It was a simple, tuneless melody, something that surfaced from a part of her memory so deep she didn't know it existed. A lullaby without words. It was fragile and soft, a thread of sound in the tense silence. Kalen's growl faltered. His burning eyes remained fixed on her, but the tension in his small shoulders eased by a fraction. He was still a wild thing, but he was listening. She kept humming, her own fear a tight knot in her stomach. What was she doing? This was the prince. She was a nobody. This was a line she shouldn't be crossing, but she couldn't make herself stop. The melody was a bridge between them, a quiet space in the chaos. The guards watched, stunned into silence. They saw it too. The slow, almost imperceptible calming of their untamable charge. The air in the kitchen suddenly dropped 10 degrees. The casual clatter from the hallway ceased. A presence filled the doorway, vast and absolute. Alara didn't need to look. She felt it on her skin, a wave of immense power and bone-deep cold. The Alpha King. She risked a glance over her shoulder. Malachi stood there, a titan framed by the stone archway. He was even more imposing up close, his shoulders seeming to block out all the light. His face was a mask of harsh carved lines, and his silver eyes were fixed on the scene. But they weren't looking at his son. They were fixed on her. The humming died in her throat. The fragile connection shattered. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her. She had overstepped. She had touched something sacred and broken, and now the wrath of the frozen king was upon her. She squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the thunder of his voice, for the command that would have her thrown into the dungeons or worse. But it didn't come. There was only a profound, echoing silence. Slowly, she dared to open her eyes again. The king hadn't moved. His expression was unreadable, a storm held in check. He looked from her to his son, who had tensed again at his father's arrival but hadn't bolted. A flicker of something, confusion, disbelief, crossed the king's face. It was there and gone in a heartbeat. He took a single, deliberate step into the kitchen. The guards stiffened to attention. "Leave us," he said. His voice was not the thunder she expected. It was deep. Yes, like the rumble of a distant avalanche, but quiet. Deadly quiet. The guards bowed low and practically fled the room. Marta and the others had already vanished. Suddenly, the cavernous kitchen was empty save for the three of them, the king, the feral prince, and the worthless kitchen maid on the floor. Alara felt trapped. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage of bone. She should get up. She should apologize, beg, run. But she was paralyzed, pinned by the sheer weight of his presence. Malachi's gaze shifted to his son. "Kalen," he said, and the name was heavy with a history of pain. The boy flinched, pressing himself harder into the corner, the apple held up like a talisman against the world. He recognized his name, but it brought him no comfort. It was the name of the prince who had failed to die, the name of his father's disappointment. The king's jaw tightened. A muscle worked in his cheek. He was used to commanding armies, to bending alphas to his will with a single word, but he was powerless against the grief locked inside his own child. This was his damage, Alara realized. This was the wound that would not heal. He was a king of immeasurable power, but he couldn't reach his own son. He looked back at Alara, and his silver eyes were not just cold now. They were filled with a desolation so profound it stole her breath. He saw her, truly saw her, not as a servant or a piece of furniture, but as the one thing in this room that had, for a fleeting moment, made a difference. You, he said, the single word hanging in the air. What is your name? Ilara, she whispered, her voice barely audible. He considered her for a long moment, his gaze so intense, she felt it like a physical touch. He was not looking at her with anger. It was something far more terrifying. It was a dawning, desperate hope. He was a drowning man, and he was looking at her as if she were a piece of driftwood. You will come with me, he stated. It wasn't a request. It was a command that altered the very fabric of her world. You will be his caretaker. Alara's mind went blank. His caretaker? Her? The scullery maid? It made no sense. She was nothing. She knew nothing of caring for a prince. She only knew how to be small, how to be invisible. Your Majesty, she stammered, finding her voice. I can't. I don't know how. You will learn, he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. He looked at Kaelin, who was still watching Alara, his little body a knot of fear, but his eyes holding a flicker of curiosity she hadn't seen before. For the first time in 5 years, the king said, his voice dropping so low it was almost a confession. He listened. And with that, her life was over. And a new, terrifying one had just begun. The royal wing was another world. The cold here was different. Not the damp, creeping chill of the kitchens, but the sterile, pristine cold of untouchable things. Tapestries thick with silver thread absorbed all sound. Plush carpets swallowed her footsteps, and the air smelled of beeswax and old, lonely velvet. She was given new clothes, simple but made of soft wool that didn't scratch her skin. She was given a room of her own, small but with a real bed and a window that overlooked the silent, snow-dusted central courtyard. It was more luxury than she had ever known, and it felt like a cage. She was an imposter, a crow dressed in dove's feathers, and she was certain that at any moment someone would realize the mistake and cast her back into the darkness. Her duty was simple and impossible. Care for Prince Kaelin. She was his shadow, his keeper, his friend? No, she wouldn't dare presume that. She was a tool the king was using, a last desperate attempt to fix what was broken. The first few days were a study in silent tension. Kaelin tolerated her presence, but he did not acknowledge it. He moved through his opulent suite of rooms like a ghost, a small, angry specter of loss. He would sit for hours, staring at nothing. He would trace patterns on the frosted window panes with one small finger. He would not eat what was brought to him, would not look at the tutors who came and left in frustrated sighs. Alara did not push. She remembered the terror in his eyes in the pantry. So she simply existed in his space. She sat in a chair in the corner of the room while he stared into the fire, and she mended his torn clothes. She brought him his food and ate her own simple meal at the same time, on the other side of the room, in silence. She did not try to talk to him, not with words. Instead, she hummed. That same strange, wordless melody. She would hum it while she tidied his room, while she laid out his clothes. It was a quiet, constant presence, a thread of sound in his silent world. After a week, something shifted. He was sitting by the window, watching the snow fall. She was on the floor, polishing a small wooden chest, humming her tune. A small, perfect snowflake landed on the glass in front of him. He turned, his silver eyes finding hers across the room. He pointed a finger at the snowflake, then looked back at her. It was the first time he had initiated any kind of contact. Her heart leaped. "It's beautiful," she whispered, her voice soft so as not to startle him. He didn't react, turning back to the window. But the bridge was there, a single, fragile strand. She started talking to him then, in that same quiet whisper. She didn't ask him questions or demand responses. She just narrated her day, described the things she saw. "The snow is getting deeper now," Soon it will cover the tops of the hedges. Marta will be yelling about the firewood delivery. She always does. She gave him a world outside his silent prison, a world of small, ordinary things. Perv, and she told him stories. They were old tales she didn't know she knew, rising from the same forgotten well as her melody. Stories of forest spirits and star-crossed lovers, of ancient trees that held the memories of the world. They were stories of belonging, of finding one's place. Everything she longed for herself. One evening, she was telling a story about a lost prince of the Fae, a boy who had forgotten his name and lived among the wolves. They called him Phelan, she whispered, the name feeling right on her tongue. The wolf friend. Kaelin, who was curled in a large armchair pretending to be asleep, made a small sound. A soft sigh. It was the first sound she had heard from him that wasn't a growl or a cry. From that day on, in the privacy of their rooms, she called him Phelan. It was their secret. Kaelin was the broken prince the kingdom mourned. Phelan was the quiet boy who listened to stories and watched the snow fall. The king visited. Not often, but his appearances were like sudden storms. He would stand in the doorway, his immense presence filling the space, and simply watch. He never stayed long. He would ask her a few perfunctory questions. Is he eating? Has there been any change? He ate some bread today, she would report, her eyes on the floor. He watched the guards drilling in the courtyard for a few minutes. Small things. Tiny, fragile signs of life. Each time, the king would nod, a curt, formal gesture. But Alara could see the desperate hope warring with the crushing despair in his eyes. He was so terrified of hoping, so certain he would be disappointed again. She saw her own feelings mirrored in him. The fear, the loneliness, the feeling of being utterly out of her depth. They were both broken, just in different ways. He was shattered by a loss he could not forget, and she was hollowed out by a belonging she had never known. One night she was woken by a sound, a thin, keening wail from Kaelin's room. A nightmare. She rushed in to find him thrashing in his bed, his face pale with sweat, his hands clenched in the blankets. He was trapped in a memory, his silent screams echoing the ones from the fire. She didn't call the guards. She sat on the edge of his bed and took his small, cold hand in hers, and she started to sing. Not just humming, but singing, the words of the lullaby finally coming to her. It was a song of stars and silver light, of a love that outlasts the darkness. His thrashing slowly subsided. His breathing evened out. He was still asleep, but the terror had receded. He clung to her hand like a lifeline. She sat there for what felt like hours, a statue in the moonlight, her hand held captive by a sleeping prince, her voice a fragile shield against the dark. She didn't know when the king arrived. She only knew that she looked up, and he was there, standing in the shadows by the door. He had been there for a long time. He hadn't made a sound. He had just been watching her. The look on his face was stripped bare of all its royal frost. It was just raw, naked pain, and something else. A profound, aching gratitude that hit her with the force of a physical blow. He was looking at her as if she had just saved his entire world. He walked over to the bed, his movements unnaturally quiet. He looked down at his son, his hand still clasped in hers. Then he looked at her. "Does it still hurt?" She found herself whispering, the question audacious, unthinkable. She wasn't asking about a physical wound. The king's mask slipped entirely. The glacier cracked. For a moment, she saw the man buried beneath the ice. "Every day," he breathed. The admission a shard of glass in the quiet room. He reached out, his large, calloused hand hovering for a moment before it gently rested on her shoulder. His touch was not cold, it was warm, a startling, grounding warmth that spread through her like wildfire. It was the first truly warm thing she had felt in years. "Thank you, Alara," he said, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. In that moment, under the weight of his hand, with the sleeping prince holding hers, the vast, lonely castle felt a little less cold. It felt, for the first time, like a place she might, impossibly, belong. The thought was so terrifying and so beautiful it made her want to weep. The warmth of the king's hand on her shoulder lingered for days, a phantom heat that was both a comfort and a torment. It was a reminder of a connection she had no right to feel, a spark of hope in the tinderbox of her desolate heart. She tried to crush it, to remind herself of her place. She was a servant. He was a king. And between them lay an ocean of grief and duty. But something had irrevocably shifted between them. His visits became more frequent, his excuses flimsier. He would appear with a book of legends for Kaelin, his eyes finding hers over the top of the boy's head. He'd bring a rare winter bloom for the vase in the room, claiming the space needed color, but the gesture felt intensely personal. They spoke more, not of politics or the kingdom, but of small things, of Kaelin, of the stories she told him. He would ask about the legends and she would retell them, her voice soft in the quiet of the prince's rooms. He listened with an unnerving intensity, as if her simple words held some profound truth he'd been searching for. She was tending to Kaelin, but she was also, in a strange, unspoken way, tending to him. She was a flicker of light in his long, dark night, and he was drawn to it. A moth to a flame he knew could burn him. He would watch her with Kaelin, Phelan, as she now exclusively called him in their private world, and a look of profound longing would cross his face. He was seeing not just his son healing, but the ghost of the family he had lost, and the impossible dream of a new one. The court began to notice. Whispers followed Alara in the corridors like autumn leaves skittering in the wind. The kitchen maid, plucked from obscurity, the king's new pet. The whispers were sharp with jealousy and suspicion. She did her best to ignore them, to fold back into her invisibility, but it was too late. The king had seen her, and now everyone else did too. One afternoon, Kaelin did something extraordinary. Ilara had built a small fortress of pillows on the floor, and they were hiding inside, pretending to be knights in a besieged castle. Kaelin, caught up in the game, let out a small, breathy sound. A laugh. It was rusty, fragile, but it was unmistakably a laugh. Alara's heart stopped. She stared at him, and he looked back, his own eyes wide with surprise, as if the sound had come from someone else. He clapped a hand over his mouth, his old fear returning. "It's all right," she said gently, her own voice trembling. It was a wonderful sound. At that moment the king entered. He froze in the doorway, having clearly heard it. He looked at Kaelin, then at Alara, and the hope in his face was so bright it was painful to see. He didn't say a word. He just nodded, a slow, deliberate motion, and left. But the shared moment hung in the air, a testament to the miracle she was weaving in the heart of his desolate home. The fragile peace was shattered by an arrival. The Dowager Queen Livia, Malachi's mother, swept into the citadel like a winter storm, her entourage of grim-faced ladies-in-waiting in her wake. She was a woman carved from marble and disapproval, her silver hair coiled in an intricate, severe crown, her eyes the same shade of glacial ice as her son's, but holding none of his buried grief. They held only judgment. She had been away, visiting the southern Pax, and had clearly heard the rumors. Her arrival was not a social call. It was an inspection, an inquisition. Ilara felt Livia's gaze on her the moment she entered the prince's chambers. It was a physical force, cold and sharp, stripping her bare, weighing her, and finding her wanting. Livia surveyed the scene, the pillow fort still in a heap on the floor, The prince sitting not at a desk with a tutor but on a rug with a book of fairy tales, and the kitchen maid sitting beside him. Malachi, Livia said, her voice like the crack of freezing ice. She did not acknowledge Alara's presence at all. What is the meaning of this? The heir to the throne is being raised in a nursery by a servant? Malachi, who had been standing by the window, turned. His face was granite. She is his caretaker, mother. And he is improving. Improving! Livia scoffed, her gaze flicking to Kalen, who had shrunk into himself, his small body tense. He looks as feral as ever. And you have this nobody filling his head with peasant stories and coddling his affliction. Her eyes finally landed on Alara, and the contempt in them was a physical blow. She is a stain on this court, a packless stray. Her presence here is an insult to your dead wife's memory. The words struck Malachi like a slap. The air crackled with his sudden silent fury. The temperature in the room dropped. "Do not speak of Lyra," he said, his voice dangerously soft. "I will speak of her." Livia's voice rose. "She was a true queen, of a pure bloodline, and you allow this kitchen girl to take her place, to insinuate herself into your life and your son's? She has done more for Kalen in 2 months than all of your healers have done in 5 years," Malachi countered, his control fraying. "Because she encourages his weakness. She treats him like a pet, not a prince. Send her away, Malachi. Send her back to the scullery where she belongs before she poisons this family further." Livia took a step towards Alara, her face a mask of cold fury. Alara felt herself shrinking, the old, familiar worthlessness washing over her. She was a stain, a nobody. Livia was right. What was she doing here? This was a world she had no place in. She wanted to run, to disappear back into the anonymity of the kitchens. Kalen, seeing the direction of his grandmother's wrath, let out a low growl, the first she had heard from him in weeks. He moved, placing his small body partially in front of Alara, a tiny, defiant shield. Livia gasped, horrified. "You see, she has turned him into a beast." Malachi moved then, crossing the room in 2 long strides. He didn't stand beside Alara, but slightly in front of her, a bulwark of solid power between her and his mother. The gesture was possessive, protective, absolute. "She stays." The words, quiet and final, echoed in the sudden silence. It was not a debate. It was the unshakable decree of an alpha king. A title-worthy line delivered not with a shout, but with the deadly certainty of a closing fist. Livia's eyes widened, her composure cracking for the first time. She stared at her son, at the way he was shielding the girl, and her lips thinned into a venomous line. She saw the truth. This wasn't just about the boy. This was about her son's frozen heart beginning to thaw, and she saw it not as a healing, but as a betrayal. "You are a fool, Malachi," she hissed, her voice low and shaking with rage. "You are choosing this nothing over your own blood, over your duty." "She is my duty," Malachi said, his gaze unwavering. "She is his healing, and mine." Livia turned, her silk skirts rustling like dry, dead leaves. She stalked out of the room without another word, but her parting look at Alara was a promise of war. She had lost the battle, but Alara knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that the Dowager Queen had no intention of losing the war. The Dowager Queen's declaration of war was a silent one. Livia was too cunning for open confrontation. Instead, she began to weave a web of ice around Alara. Doors would close as Alara approached. Conversations would halt, replaced by cold stares. Servants who had once offered a timid smile now looked through her as if she were made of glass. Livia was reasserting the natural order of the citadel, reminding everyone that Alara was an outsider, a blight. The pressure was immense, a constant grinding weight on her soul. The self-doubt she had fought so hard to keep at bay came roaring back. Livia's words echoed in her mind. A stain. A nobody. A peasant. Was she? Was her presence here truly harming the prince, holding him back from what he was meant to be? Was the king's kindness just a symptom of his grief? A temporary madness? Her only sanctuary was the prince's chambers. Inside that small world with Phelan, the whispers couldn't reach her. Their bond deepened in the face of the court's hostility. He began to lean on her, literally. When they walked in the walled garden, his small hand would find hers. When she read to him, he would rest his head against her arm. They were two outcasts, clinging to each other in a cold, hostile world. Malachi saw her struggle. He saw the shadows under her eyes, the way she flinched when a courtier passed. His anger was a quiet, simmering thing. He began to make a point of seeking her out in public. He would request her presence in the library while he reviewed documents, seating her near the fire with a book. He would walk with her and Kaelin in the garden, his large frame a clear and present warning to anyone who dared to whisper. These small acts of defiance only fueled Livia's quiet rage, but for Ilara, they were lifelines. Each public acknowledgement from the king was a brick in the crumbling wall of her self-worth. He saw her. He valued her. The thought was still terrifying, but it was also becoming essential, like air. One evening, he found her alone in the library. She had been sent to fetch a book for Kaelin and had lingered, running her fingers over the leather-bound spines. The scent of old paper and knowledge was a comfort. "You are afraid," he said, his voice making her jump. He was standing in the shadows, watching her. She nodded, unable to speak. "Of my mother?" "Of everything," she confessed in a whisper. "Of this place. Of failing you. Of failing him. Of what I am starting to feel for you," she thought, but did not say. He closed the distance between them, his presence dominating the cavernous room. He stopped a few feet from her, his silver eyes searching her face. "You cannot fail," he said, his voice raw with conviction. "You are the only thing that has not failed." He reached out, not to touch her, but to trace the title of the book she held. His fingers brushed against hers. The contact was electric, a jolt of heat that shot up her arm and straight to her heart. Her breath hitched. She looked up at him, and the carefully constructed distance between king and servant evaporated. There was only Malachi and Ilara, a man and a woman drowning in a sea of unspoken things. "I see the way you look at him," she said softly, needing to break the spell. "Phelan." The corner of his mouth twitched, the barest hint of a smile. "Phelan. I like that. It suits him better than Kaelin ever did." His expression sobered. "He is all I have left of them." "You have their memories," she said gently. "Memories are ghosts, Ilara," he replied, his voice heavy. "They haunt. They do not comfort." He was so broken. The Alpha King, feared by all, was a man hollowed out by grief. And in that moment, she felt not fear of him, but an overwhelming wave of empathy. Her own hollow places, the ones carved out by a lifetime of being unwanted, ached in sympathy with his. This was the heart of their dual damage. They were two halves of a shattered whole, finding in each other's broken pieces a mirror of their own. The crisis came without warning. It was the night of the winter solstice, a time of ancient magic when the veil between worlds was thin. Livia saw her chance. Malachi was occupied with a council meeting, a rare event that would keep him away for hours. The court was distracted by preparations for the solstice feast. The prince's chambers were quiet, isolated. Ilara was helping Kaelin into his nightclothes when the chill set in. It was not the citadel's usual cold. This was a dead, creeping cold that felt like it was coming from inside the walls, from the very stones themselves. It leached the warmth from the fire, from her own blood. Kaelin whimpered, pressing close to her. He could feel it too. The air grew thick, heavy with a power that tasted of dust and regret. Strange, whispering sounds echoed from the corridor, slithering under the door. Then Livia entered. She was not dressed for a feast. She wore a severe dark gown embroidered with silver symbols Alara didn't recognize. Her eyes burned with a cold, fanatical light. Two of her most loyal ladies flanked her, their faces pale and set. "What do you want?" Alara asked, her voice trembling as she stood in front of Kaelin. "I am here to save my grandson," Livia said, her voice unnaturally calm. "To cleanse the bloodline of the taint you have inflicted upon it. There are old ways, forgotten ways, to restore what is broken, to sever unhealthy attachments and remind the blood of its duty." Fear, sharp and absolute, seized Alara. This wasn't just a threat. This was a ritual. Livia was going to use magic on the boy. "No," Alara said, her voice finding a strength she didn't know it possessed. "You will not touch him." Livia laughed, a dry, brittle sound. "You think you can stop me? You are nothing, a speck of dust. The magic of this citadel answers to its true queen." She and her ladies began to chant in a low, guttural language. The silver symbols on her dress began to glow with a sickly, pale light. The room grew colder. The light from the glowing symbols coalesced, forming shimmering, spectral chains that snaked through the air. They were not aimed at Kaelin, they were aimed at Alara. They struck her like vipers made of ice. She cried out, a searing, freezing pain erupting in her chest. It felt like her soul was being hooked, dragged from her body. The chains were binding her to Kaelin, but not in a way that connected them. They were designed to drain her, to use her life force as a catalyst. At that moment, the doors to the chamber burst open. Malachi stood there, his face a mask of thunderous rage. He had felt the shift in power, the wrongness in the air. "Mother, what have you done?" He lunged for her, but a shimmering barrier, born of the ritual, flared into existence, throwing him back. He was locked out. Livia ignored him, her chanting growing louder, more frantic. "The bond must be purged. The weakness must be burned away." The ritual was spiraling out of control. It wasn't just targeting Alara's connection to Kaelin. It was feeding on all the powerful emotions in the room. It latched onto Malachi's grief, the deepest, most potent wound in the castle. The spectral chains multiplied, wrapping around him, dragging him into the vortex. Alara saw his eyes widen in horror as he was pulled back into his worst memory. The scent of smoke filled the air, a phantom smell from a 5-year-old fire. The image of flames flickered in his eyes. He cried out, a sound of pure agony, and then he went rigid, his body still but his face, a mask of unending torment. He was trapped, frozen in a living nightmare. The ritual was now a feedback loop of unimaginable pain. Alara's life force was being siphoned away, fueling the magic that was torturing Malachi, and his agony, in turn, was amplifying the ritual's power, tightening its grip on her and Kaelin. The boy was on the floor, weeping, a thin, silent sound of pure terror, caught between the woman who was his safety and the father who was lost in his own private hell. Both were in danger, both were dying in their own way, and she was the fulcrum, the conduit for all of it. Livia, mad with her own conviction, continued to chant, oblivious to the fact that she was destroying the very son she claimed to be protecting. The cold was absolute now. It was the cold of the grave. Alara could feel her own heartbeat slowing, her consciousness fraying at the edges. The spectral chains were pulling tighter, drawing the last of her warmth, the last of her life. She was fading, becoming a ghost in truth. She could see Malachi, frozen and trapped in his endless loop of fire and loss. She could hear Kaelin's silent, desperate sobs. Livia's ritual was feeding on their bonds, on the love and grief that connected the three of them. It was a cancer, turning their own emotions into the weapon of their destruction. A terrible clarity pierced through her pain. The only way to stop it, the only way to save them, was to break the circuit. The ritual was anchored to her, to the connection she had forged with the prince and his father. If she severed that connection, if she let go, the ritual would collapse. But letting go meant severing her own soul. It meant giving up the only belonging she had ever known. It meant dying. She looked at Malachi's agonized face, at Kaylin's small, shaking form. She had been a nobody her whole life, invisible, worthless. But here, in this room, she mattered. Her life, or her death, could change everything. She made her choice. It was the only choice she could make. This was her sacrifice. To give up the fragile, beautiful life she had just begun to build, to save the broken king and his feral son. She closed her eyes, gathering the last of her strength. She didn't fight the chains anymore. She surrendered to them. She poured all the love she felt, for the boy who had shown her she could matter, for the king who had shown her she was worthy, into one final, silent act. She pushed it away from herself, directing it all towards them. Live, she thought, the word a silent scream in the void of her fading mind. Be whole. She let go. It was a moment of ultimate surrender, an act of love so pure it was an intimacy beyond any physical touch. And in that moment of choosing to become nothing for their sake, something ignited. It wasn't a death. It was an awakening. Her power, the dormant spirit and ancestral connection she never knew she possessed, roared to life. It was not tied to a bloodline of people, she suddenly understood. It was tied to the very soul of the citadel, to the lineage of the Alpha Kings, to the ancient spirit of the pack itself. And that spirit, that ancient power, recognized her sacrifice not as an end, but as the ultimate act of a queen. A blinding golden light erupted from her chest. It was not a fire. It was pure life, pure spirit. It did not fight the spectral chains. It absorbed them. The chilling cold vanished, replaced by a wave of profound warmth that filled the entire room. The light surged from her, a wave of healing and truth. It slammed into Malachi, shattering the psychic prison of his grief. It didn't just wake him from his nightmare, it poured into the 5-year-old wound in his soul and began to heal it, washing away the frost and leaving behind not forgetting, but peace. It washed over Kaylin, a gentle tide that calmed his terror, soothed his feral heart, and unlocked the cage that had held his voice for so long. Livia's chanting stopped. She stared, her face a mask of disbelief and horror, as her ritual was undone, consumed by a power she could not comprehend. The light receded, coalescing back into Alara. She was still standing, swaying on her feet, drained but incandescent, a faint golden aura clinging to her skin. The silence in the room was absolute. Then, a sound. A clear, small voice. Alara. It was Kaylin. He was looking at her, his silver eyes wide and clear, free of the feral fire for the first time. He had spoken. Not the secret name she had given him. Her name. He had given it back to her. A gift of immeasurable worth. Malachi was on his feet, the last vestiges of the nightmare fading from his eyes. The haunted look was gone. The endless winter in his soul had broken. He looked at his son, who had just spoken his first word in 5 years. Then he looked at Alara, who had saved them both. Who had saved him? His face was a canvas of raw, overwhelming emotion. Awe, gratitude, and a love so powerful it was a physical force in the room. The world narrowed to the space between them, the shattered ritual, the cowering form of his mother, the astonished gasps of the courtiers now crowding the doorway. None of it mattered. Malachi crossed the room, his steps deliberate and certain. He didn't stop until he was standing before her, so close she could feel the warmth radiating from him. He reached out and cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently stroking her cheeks. His touch was a reverence. "Alara," he breathed, his voice thick. She leaned into his touch, her strength failing her. He gathered her into his arms, holding her as if she were the most precious, fragile thing in the world. It wasn't a king holding a servant. It was a man holding his salvation. They just stood there for a long moment, breathing each other in, two survivors clinging to the wreckage, finally safe. He pulled back just enough to look into her eyes. The silver depths of his were clear and bright, reflecting her own face, her own faint golden light. All the walls were down, all the boundaries erased. "I love you," he said. The words were not a desperate confession in a crisis. They were a statement of absolute truth, spoken in the calm after the storm. They were the foundation of a new world. "I'm saying that I love you, and it's the only thing that has ever felt real." Tears she didn't know she was holding back streamed down her face, tears of relief, of joy, of a belonging so profound it remade her from the inside out. "I love you," she whispered back, the words feeling like coming home. Kalen came to them then, his small hand reaching out to take his father's. He looked up at Alara, a real, true smile gracing his lips for the first time. He placed his other hand in hers. The circuit was complete again, but this time it was not a prison of pain. It was a circle of family. Malachi looked over their heads at his mother, who was being held by the guards, her face a ruin of hate and defeat. His expression was cold, absolute. "Take her to the dungeons. She is no longer queen. She is nothing. Justice, swift and final." He then looked back down at Alara, his gaze softening into something that made her heart ache with its beauty. He lowered his head and kissed her, a gentle, reverent kiss that sealed their new reality. It was a promise of a future, a life, a home. In the heart of the cold Gothic castle, spring had finally, impossibly arrived. 3 months later, the citadel was transformed. Sunshine, once a rare visitor, now seemed to find its way into every corner, slanting through high-arched windows and warming the ancient stones. The oppressive chill was gone, replaced by the sounds of life, of laughter, of a pack that finally had its heart back. Queen Alara, the title still felt strange and dreamlike on her tongue, stood on a balcony overlooking the central garden. The snow had long since melted, and the first hardy mountain roses were beginning to bloom, their deep crimson a splash of vibrant color against the gray stone. A gentle breeze carried their faint, sweet scent. A pair of strong arms wrapped around her from behind, and a familiar warmth enveloped her. Malachi rested his chin on her shoulder, his presence a solid, comforting anchor. He was a different man. The glacier had melted, revealing the strong, warm earth beneath. The lines of grief on his face had softened, replaced by a quiet joy. He still carried his past, but it was no longer a crushing weight. It was a part of his story, a story that was now intertwined with hers. "What are you thinking about?" he murmured, his lips brushing her ear. "I'm thinking," she said softly, leaning back against his chest, "that I never knew a place could feel like home." "It wasn't a home," he replied, his voice a low rumble. "It was a tomb. You brought it back to life. You brought us back to life." Down in the garden, Kalen was chasing a butterfly. He was no longer the feral pup. He was a boy. He still had his quiet moments, his shadows, but they were fleeting. He spoke now, in short, thoughtful sentences. He laughed, a sound that was now the truest music in the castle. He was healing, surrounded by a love so fierce and protective, it left no room for the ghosts of the past. Ilara had found her own history, not in some long-lost noble bloodline, but in the very spirit of the pack she now led. The ancestral power that had awoken within her was a deep, intuitive connection to her people, to the land itself. She was not just a queen by marriage, The magic of the citadel had claimed her as its own. The pack felt it too. The initial suspicion and jealousy had transformed into a deep, abiding respect. She was the queen who had healed their king and saved their prince. She was the heart of their home. Livia had been exiled, stripped of her titles and sent to a remote, fortified convent at the edge of the kingdom, a comfortable prison where her poison could harm no one else. Her name was never spoken. The wound she had inflicted was healing, leaving behind a scar that served as a reminder of how close they had come to losing everything. Kalen, having finally caught the butterfly, held it gently in his cupped hands. He ran over to the balcony, his face bright with excitement. "Look!" Alara and Malachi smiled. "It's beautiful, my love," Alara said. Kalen looked at the butterfly, then up at them. "Like us," he said, a simple, profound truth. He opened his hands, and the butterfly took flight, a speck of vibrant life soaring into the clear blue sky. Malachi squeezed her hand. "Like us," he agreed, his voice thick with emotion. Alara looked from her son to her husband, her heart so full it felt like it might burst. The invisible kitchen maid, the worthless orphan, was gone. In her place was a woman who was loved, who was powerful, who belonged. She had walked through fire and ice to get here. But as she stood in the warmth of the sun, held by the man she loved, she knew, with every fiber of her being, that she was finally, truly home. The fairy tale wasn't about a prince saving a pauper. It was about two broken souls finding each other in the darkness and walking into the light together, hand in hand.